Chapter 1. A Deadly Year. The Great Plague of London, 1665. The rat looked dead. Good woman Phillips nudged it with her toe to be sure. It didn't move. She bent down, pinched its tail between her thumb and forefinger, and lifted the rat up so it dangled limply before her face. "Come into my kitchen and die on my clean floor, will you?" she said menacingly to the little corpse. "We'll see about that, you dirty beast." Good woman noticed with disgust that fleas were still jumping in the rat's coarse black fur. It hadn't been dead for long, probably frozen to death. The winter of 1665 was the coldest she could remember. She opened the door and swung the rat by its tail, flinging it as far as from the house as she could. It landed with a thud in the gutter. Good riddance, thought good woman Phillips. She wiped her hands on her skirt before heading inside to make breakfast. She thought no more about the rat that day. She was a busy woman with a husband and sons to feed. For a poor family like hers, living outside the walls of London in the rough and tumble parish of St. Giles in the Fields, food was often hard to come by. Worse, with this winter's dreadful cold, they needed more fuel than usual for the fire. Good woman feared that the extra expense would mean Christmas, not even a week away, would be a lean and dismal holiday this year. Good woman Phillips was right to worry about Christmas. There would be no celebrating in her home. As the dark December day wore on her, her head began aching and pain grew in her back, arms, and legs until she could hardly stand. Then fever and chills set in. By evening, she was forced to take to her bed. She lay in a daze, trying not to moan. Signs in the sky. Day by day, good woman Phillips got sicker. Her son sat by her bedside in the evening, trying to distract her with the latest news from London. The whole city was buzzing with rumors about the comet that had been seen flaring across the heavens every clear night since November. Many believed that the comet was a side from God to England's king, Charles II, who had been on the throne for just 4 years. People remembered an old superstition that the crowning of a new king would be followed by plague. These blazing stars threatened the world with famine, plague, and wars. To princes, death; to kingdoms, many crises; to all estates, inevitable losses, was the dismal forecast of one popular astrologer. As a fresh wave of fever shook good woman Phillips, her sons crept away, leaving her to rest. Soon she was tossing in a restless, feverish sleep. House call. When good woman Phillips opened her eyes next, it was the light in the room. A tall man in a long coat was unpacking a leather satchel and laying out items along the wooden bench under the window. A cloth, a knife. Good woman realized at once who this man was and why he was there. A doctor. "I'll not be bled," she tried for a firm, clear tone, but even to her own ears her voice was low and faltering. The doctor turned and looked at her calmly. "Goody Phillips, your husband and your sons have consulted me about your case. Bleeding will balance the humors within your body. It is for the best." The doctor came closer. She could see the knife glinting on his hand. Then it was done, a smooth, quick cut on her arm. Blood dripped into the cup he held. Her head thudded, and the room seemed to lift and tilt, then spin. "Fainted," said the doctor. "Not uncommon for one so far gone with fever. Let's hope this bloodletting was done in time." Good woman Phillips didn't wake again. On Christmas Eve of 1664, she died, the first victim in an epidemic of plague that was to kill nearly 1 in 5 Londoners over the next coming year. It's not funny, it's humoral. From ancient times until the 19th century, when a doctor told you your humors were out of balance, he didn't mean that there was something wrong with your funny bone. Humoral theory was one of the key principles in Western medicine. According to this theory, first proposed by the doctors of ancient Greece, the human body contained 4 humors, or fluids: black bile, also known as melancholy; yellow or red bile, blood; and phlegm. Your health depended on maintaining the right humoral balance, or mix of fluids inside your body. Curing disease was a matter of putting the humors back in balance. This is where the idea of bleeding patients came from. God have mercy upon us. A neighbor woman came that afternoon to wash the body and prepare it for burial. When the neighbor removed good woman Phillips's nightdress, she gasped. Large red rings had appeared on the dead woman's chest and back. Her right arm was an ominous purple swelling. "A bubo! Plague tokens," whimpered the shaken woman. "Plain as my hand, these are the signs. This is a plague house. Oh, God, have mercy on us." She turned and fled down the stairs and out of the house. Before long, there was a knocking at the door of the Phillipses' tiny house. The searcher had arrived. It was the searcher's duty to visit every house where a death occurred in St. Giles in the Fields. to examine the deceased and to report back to the parish clerk who recorded the death in the parish register. All 119 London parishes kept registers of births and deaths, bulky volumes filled with line after line describing deaths from old age, accidents, and illnesses of every kind. Yet of all the ways to die in 1664, none was more feared than plague. For plague could spread through a neighborhood like fire. In a matter of weeks, plague could engulf a whole city, even a whole country. The searcher for St. Giles in the Field was a shrunken, wrinkled old woman. She was desperately poor and spent every cent she had on ale at the inn. It was well known that she'd gladly take a coin or two should a family wish to have the cause of death changed in the report she delivered to the parish clerk. For a small tip, a suicide could become an accident. Even plague could be registered as a simple fever. But the Phillips family had no money to offer her. Her sons had spent everything they had to bring the doctor in to bleed their mother. The searcher peered down drunkenly at the body, then reeled away in alarm at the sight of the swollen lumps called buboes, proof that good woman Phillips had died of the disease we now know as bubonic plague. She staggered off, returning later with men from the parish office who began boarding up the doors and windows. The dead woman's family would not be allowed to leave their house for weeks, in case they spread plague to others. Inside the darkened house, good man Phillips and his son listened as nail after nail was pounded in the boards blocking their windows. Finally, the pounding was replaced by the softer sound of brushes. A huge red cross was painted on the door and the words, "God have mercy upon us." Those signs let everyone in the neighborhood know that the house was cursed with the plague. That Christmas Eve, all was silent in the Phillips house. Good woman's husband and sons could only wait and wonder which one of them would be next. Outside, their neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the boarded up house, fearing that if they came too close, they would be contaminated with plague seeds. The fear builds. A little more than a week after the death of good woman Phillips, soon after New Year's, John Graunt stepped to the door of his London shop and tossed a coin to one of the ragged boys shivering in the frosty January air outside. "Run and fetch me a copy of the Bills of Mortality. The first bill of the year was printed this morning, and I'm anxious to see it. You may find me in a generous mood to repay you for your speed." As he watched the boy disappear up the cobbled road, John considered how surprising it was that the Bills of Mortality, a page of statistics listing the week's births and deaths in each London parish, should have become so popular with readers. Each week in the coffee houses and the taverns, conversation was sure to turn to the latest news in the bills, especially if there were any unusual deaths. John Graunt always found the Bills of Mortality fascinating, but he'd heard that there was something he could find particularly interesting in this week's edition. And when the errand boy ran back with the page fluttering in his hands, it didn't take long for John to spot it. Death by Plague 1. London hadn't had an epidemic of plague for nearly 20 years, and plague usually struck in the hot months of summer, not in the midst of the coldest winter that anyone could remember. But all the same, John decided to keep a close eye on the bills over the next few months. For the rest of the cold, dark winter, while all of London was watching the sky, John was scanning the lists of deaths, reading the signs there that told him an epidemic of plague was coming again. Looking for answers. As the owner of a popular haberdashery, a store selling cloth, John Graunt was an expert on everything from the coarsest cottons to the finest silks and velvets, along with buttons, thread, and ribbons in every color of the rainbow. But running a successful business wasn't enough to keep John's active mind occupied. He really wanted to make a name for himself as a scientist or a scholar. He'd always been fascinated with the weekly bills of mortality, and by the late 1650s, he had saved several years' worth of the weekly statistics. John realized that those dusty stacks held a treasure trove of information. As a businessman, he knew the value of having information about his customers. He needed to know approximately how many births to expect each year so that he could stock the right amount of delicate linen for christening robes. And by knowing how many deaths there might be in a year, he could have enough cloth for mourning clothes on hand. At the time, there was no source for this kind of data. John, like other shopkeepers, was forced to depend on his intuition and experience when ordering his stock. Yet since 1592, the weekly bills of mortality had been tracking these numbers and more. By reading through all the bills and adding up the deaths and births, John realized he would be able to work out annual averages and perhaps find useful patterns. He began to wonder what other uses there might be for the information about birth and death rates in his city. Comparing the numbers of deaths and their causes from one year to another might reveal patterns, not only in how many people were dying, but also why. John Graunt decided that he had found the perfect subject for a scientific study. What about dying of curiosity? Plague wasn't the only thing killing Londoners during the 17th century. The bills of mortality were full of unusual ways to die. Some that you are not likely to see in any obituary today include stoppage in the stomach, twisting of the guts, eaten by lice, and the mysterious horseshoe head. Success at last. John Graunt collected all the bills of mortality from the past 60 years and studied them, looking for the secrets that held out about London life. In 1662, he published his findings in a short book with a long title, Natural and Political Observations mentioned in a following index and made upon the bills of mortality with reference to the government, religion, trade, growth, air, diseases, and several changes of the said city. Blast from the past. Many people have heard of the Black Death, the pandemic of plague in the Middle Ages that killed almost a third of the people in Europe. But the world has suffered through not just one, but three plague pandemics. The first is the plague of Justinian, named after the Roman Emperor Justinian I. The disease first broke out in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 541 Common Era. It swept through the city, killing up to 5,000 people a day before going on to spread across Spain, Italy, Africa, and the Middle East. Over the next 3 years, it killed as many as 50 million people. Afterward, plague outbreaks continued, but didn't reach pandemic levels again until 1347, when traders and invading armies carried the disease into Europe. Whole villages were wiped out by the plague death, crops were unharvested, and trade stopped. Some historians think 1/3 of the population died in the pandemic. It took 200 years for the population to recover. The next great pandemic of plague started in 1855 and lasted 100 years. Rats hiding in steamships carried the disease across the world, causing outbreaks in port cities on every continent. Over 15 million people died. Will there be a fourth pandemic of plague? It's possible, but unlikely. Plague can now be treated with antibiotics, and thanks to modern hygiene, many cities are cleaner with fewer rats. Back to success at last. His book was an instant hit, and in 1663, John was admitted to a very exclusive club of scientists, the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. Although John modestly described his accomplishment as just shopkeeper's mathematics, he developed a method for predicting the arrival of a plague year. This was a tremendous scientific advancement. For more than a century, the people of London had suffered regular epidemics of plague, one almost every 20 years. Tens of thousands had died, and the city's inhabitants lived in fear of the next outbreak. By studying the bills of mortality, John realized that in the months leading up to an outbreak of plague, deaths from all causes were higher than usual. Sickly years, he called them. The winter of 1664 was the start of a very sickly year in London. Goodwoman Phillips's death was the first one to be recorded as plague, but he was sure it wouldn't be the last. The sickly year theory. By watching the number of deaths closely and seeing as they began to rise each week, John Graunt was able to predict a plague epidemic. He looked at all deaths, not just from plague, because he knew the system for recording deaths in London wasn't very accurate. Years before, King James I had ordered each London parish, the district surrounding a church, to begin keeping track of all the local births and deaths. Officials called parish clerks were in charge of the records. Since there weren't enough clerks to track down all the births and deaths in the crowded city, they depended on searchers, like the one who visited Goodwoman Phillips's home, to collect the information they needed. This system had a few problems. For one thing, the searchers had no medical background. Tool of the trade, descriptive epidemiology. Epidemiology is all about looking at the big picture of disease outbreak. While physicians try to help individual patients get well, epidemiologists help to keep us from getting sick in the first place. To do this, they need to understand who is getting sick, what's causing the disease, and how it is spreading. Once they have all that information, they can try to figure out how to stop the outbreak. Most countries today keep track of deaths and any unusual cases of infectious diseases. In 1665, there was very little of this kind of information. John Graunt was the first person in England to realize that keeping accurate records of the number of people who died each year could help fight disease. His analysis of the bills of mortality for 1664 and 1665 is one of the earliest examples of what we now call descriptive epidemiology. It is the first step in putting together the big picture of a disease outbreak. For an epidemiologist, putting together that big picture means using data, lots of it, to describe the who, what, when, and where of the outbreak. The answers to these questions are clues to how and why the epidemic is spreading information that they can use to fight the disease. Back to the sickly year theory. When it wasn't clear what someone had died from, they had to guess. This led to some unusual entries in the bills of mortality, like teeth, pining, evil, fools, etc., and found dead. In addition, the searchers weren't paid much, so for the price of a drink and a few extra pennies, many searchers would agree to write down anything they were told. When someone had died of plague, their family would be eager to bribe the searcher to cover it up. Otherwise, the whole family would be shut up in the house to prevent them from spreading plague seeds. John Graunt estimated that up to 20% of plague deaths were recorded as something else in the bills of mortality. The third problem was that the parish clerks only recorded the births and deaths of citizens who belonged to the official religion, the Church of England. This created big gaps in the official statistics because it left out other religious groups: Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and nonconformists. There were a few more plague deaths in London through the rest of the cold winter, and as the weather warmed up, the numbers began to increase. In the first week of June, 43 deaths from plague were recorded, as many as there had been for the whole year up till then. The next week, there were 112. By fall that year, 7,000 people were dying each week. Plague had returned to London with a vengeance. Soon, anyone who could afford to leave the city began packing their bags. John Graunt stayed where he was. He had his shop to look after, but more importantly, he wanted to keep an eye on the information coming from the parishes each week. His theory about sickly years leading to plague years was being proven before his very eyes. Stay apart to stay alive. As the death count rose in London over the summer of 1665, the king took action to try to contain the spread of plague. He issued a proclamation banning all public gatherings, even funerals. The theaters and pubs were forced to close along with the universities. Parliament was cancelled, all trade was stopped, Scotland closed the border with England to try to keep the plague out. As a result of the government's actions, many people lost their jobs, but many more likely owed their lives to this early example of social distancing, a measure to prevent infection that would be used again and again in epidemics right up to the present day. The streets are empty. By mid-July, there were 1,000 people dying in London each week. By September, it was up to 1,000 a day. A Londoner named Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary, "But now, how few people I see, and those walking like people that have been taken leave of the world." Samuel was a successful businessman, but unlike most wealthy people, he didn't leave London during the plague. Instead, he stayed and recorded his impressions in his diary, which was published almost 2 centuries later. It is one of the most revealing records of what life was like for people in London during that terrible year. In the fall, with plague raging across the city, Samuel wrote, "Lord, how empty the streets are, and melancholy, so many poor sick people in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard. As I walk, everybody talking of this dead, and that man sick, and so many in this place, and so many in that. And they tell me that in Westminster there is never a physician, and but one apothecary left, all being dead. But there are great hopes of a great decrease this week. God send it." Sure enough, as fall turned to winter and the weather became colder, the plague deaths began to subside. At the end of the year, as people began cautiously returning to the city, John Graunt published his analysis of the epidemic, called London's Dreadful Visitation, or a collection of all the bills of mortality for this present year. It estimated that 68,000 people out of a population of 450,000 had died of plague. In a single year, the disease had wiped out 15% of London's population. New knowledge, but no cure. By looking carefully at statistics, John Graunt helped people realize that epidemics could be predicted. High numbers of unusual deaths might point to the start of an outbreak of disease. People no longer had to look at the stars for signs of a coming epidemic. They just had to pay attention to what was happening around them. It was the beginning of a more scientific approach to disease control and prevention. Still, much about plague remained a puzzle in 1665. How did the disease start? How did it spread? Did you catch it from breathing infected air? From contact with a victim? Could you get it from something you ate or drank? There were no answers to these questions, which made preventing and treating plague a risky guessing game. Graunt's legacy. John Graunt's discovery that plague years were preceded by sickly years was a huge step forward in tracking diseases. His recommendation that doctors and health officials pay close attention unex- to all unexplained increases in death rates is still helping epidemiologists pinpoint and stop disease outbreaks today. It was only after the Spanish influenza pandemic in the early 20th century that investigator Wade Hampton Frost realized the rates of pneumonia had been unusually high in the months leading up to the massive outbreak of the flu in U.S. Army camps. Looking back, Wade suspected that what doctors had been calling pneumonia had really been early cases of Spanish influenza. If someone had remembered the lesson of John Graunt and looked into the sudden jump in pneumonia cases, it might have led to an earlier identification of the illness. The Spanish flu swept through the United States before going global and killing millions worldwide in the winter of 1918. In 2019, when doctors in Wuhan, China, noticed more pneumonia cases than usual, they were quick to let the authorities know, hoping to avert another pandemic. But the virus had a head start. Unequal treatment. In 1665, only the wealthy and middle class could afford doctors. The thousands of poor people who suffered from plague during the London epidemic mostly relied on low-cost home remedies. A booklet from the Royal College of Physicians called Certain Necessary Directions for the Prevention and Cure of the Plague recommended this surefire method for treating painful swollen lymph glands or buboes. Pull off the feathers from the tails of living cocks, hens, pigeons, or chickens, and holding their bills, hold them hard to the botch or swelling, and so keep them at the part until the birds die, and by this means draw out the poison. No chickens handy? There were alternatives. Take a great onion, hollow it, put it into a fig, cut small. Put it into wet paper and roast it in embers. Apply it hot unto the tumor. One popular remedy was called Venice treacle. A treacle is a thick syrup. To make it, you'd need nearly 60 ingredients from cinnamon, pepper, and cloves to exotic items like viper flesh, opium, beaver glands, and dead sea salts. Vipers all sold out. London treacle was a simpler option, a mixture of cumin seeds, bayberries, snake root, cloves, and honey. To avoid catching plague, some doctors held gold coins in their mouths while they treated patients, believing the precious metal protected them. Others recommended burning herbs and spices mixed with vinegar or tar to clean the air. So many people believed that smoking tobacco would prevent plague that schoolboys were punished if they forgot to smoke each morning before their prayers. Some people wore amulets filled with toad poison to ward off the disease. And con artists sold worthless powders and mixtures, passing them off as exotic wonder drugs, powdered unicorn horn, phoenix eggs, and the kidney stones of camels. There was no way to cure plague, and doctors could do little to treat it. Bleeding had been recommended as a cure for fever since ancient Greek and Roman times. Although people often died from loss of blood, doctors continued to bleed their patients. Sweating was another common treatment. It was based on the idea that because plague caused fevers, it should be treated with heat. Doctors piled on the blankets and stoked up a fire near the victim's bed, hoping that their patient would sweat out the plague poison. If neither bleeding nor sweating worked, there was opium to dull your pain. If you could afford it. When that failed, there was only prayer left. According to John Graunt's statistics, there were only 9,967 births in London that year compared to 97,306 burials. Some wondered if the city's population would ever recover. John pointed out that London was an incredibly dangerous place to live at all times. Every year, there were far more deaths in the city than there were births, and yet the population continued to grow because people from the surrounding countryside were constantly coming to London, looking for work and a better life. John predicted that within a few years, London's population would rebound thanks to newcomers from the country. Again, he was right. Slowly, life began to return to normal in the city as people forgot the year of terror and death. Finding answers in Hong Kong. More than 200 years after the epidemic in London, scientists finally identified the source of plague. In 1894, an epidemic of bubonic plague in Hong Kong killed 80,000 people. The governor, Sir William Robinson, called for scientists to come to Hong Kong to search for solutions and save the city. A famous Japanese scientist, Shibasubaro Kitasato, answered his plea. Shibasubaro's arrival was celebrated in the papers, and he was given his own laboratory and a staff of assistants. Nobody paid much attention to another foreign researcher who answered the call for help. Alexander Yersin was a young Swiss bacteriologist, a specialist studying disease-carrying microbes and how to cure or treat the illnesses they cause, who had been practicing medicine in the French colony of Indochina, now the countries of Vietnam and Cambodia. As an unknown scientist, Alexander didn't get the same warm welcome as the famous Shibasiburo. The Hong Kong officials didn't even offer him a laboratory. He had to pay to have his own lab built, a lowly straw hut not far from the much grander building occupied by Shibasiburo. The two scientists were soon racing to be the first to discover the source of plague. The competition was so fierce that Shibasiburo tried to prevent Alexander from getting access to the bodies of plague victims. Alexander had to bribe the soldiers guarding the plague wards of hospitals to bring him the blood and tissue samples he needed. That June, each man announced that he had successfully isolated the bacteria that causes plague. The Cotton Connection. London's Great Plague may have started when infected rats and their fleas hitched a ride to the city on bales of cotton imported from Holland. Just the year before, more than 50,000 people had died in a plague epidemic in Amsterdam, Holland, and there was a busy trade in cotton between the two cities. The first deaths in the London epidemic happened in a neighborhood called St. Giles in the Fields, where many dock workers lived. These workers could have been bitten by plague-infected fleas while unloading bales of cotton from the boats and bringing it into the city for sale. Ironically, John Graunt may have been selling cloth made from that cotton in his shop, while spending his evenings tracking the spread of the epidemic it had caused through the city. Trade, travel, and disease have a long history of connection, from the trade caravans that brought plague rats to Europe, from Central Asia to the slave ships that carried mosquitoes breeding yellow fever to the United States, to today's international flights that can carry virus-infected humans anywhere they want to go. Whenever humans have found a way to make travel easier and faster, they have also made the spread of disease easier and faster. At first, Shibasaburo was credited with the discovery, but then the scientific community decided that Alexander had been first, and the bacteria was named Yersinia pestis in his honor. A few years later, French researcher Paul-Louis Simon discovered that the fleas called Xenocelia chiopus transferred the infection from rat to rat. When a rat died, its fleas sometimes jumped to a nearby human. Their bites passed the disease to humans. It took nearly 40 years for Simon's research to be accepted by the scientific and medical communities, but the mystery of the plague was finally solved. The future of plague. Today, plague can be successfully treated with antibiotics if patients get medical attention in time. But the disease is still a feared killer. In 1993, South and Central India were rattled by several earthquakes that damaged a number of cities, including Bangalore, Bombay, Hyderabad, and Madras, as well as many other small villages and towns. In the earthquake's aftermath, huge shanty towns and slums sprang up to house people who had been left homeless by the disaster. The shanty towns also sheltered large numbers of rats. In September 1994, plague broke out in one of the largest slums in the city of Surat. 55 people died, an insignificant number compared to the terrible death tolls of the medieval plague epidemics, but enough to make headlines around the world. Commercial air traffic to and from India stopped, the stock market in India crashed, trade halted, and the media went crazy speculating about the possibility that plague could spread to other countries, triggering a massive pandemic. Luckily, it didn't happen. A perfect pair, cities and disease. As soon as humans started living in permanent settlements, we opened the door to disease-carrying microbes. Diseases spread easily in crowded conditions and densely packed cities with poor sanitation are the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Until the 20th century, so many city dwellers died each year from infectious diseases that without a steady stream of new arrivals from the countryside, most cities would have soon become ghost towns. Plague was one of the most feared diseases because its deadly epidemic seemed to come out of nowhere. And in fact, the agent responsible for transmitting plague to humans is almost invisible. The culprit is the rat flea. Attracted by humans' garbage, Attracted by humans' garbage, rats had moved into the settlements, bringing along their annoying roommates, Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, in their guts and bloodstreams, and the fleas in their fur. Once a flea bites a rat infected with Yersinia, it carries the bacteria along to the next rat or person it dines on. In the crowded, unsanitary cities, fleas jump easily from rat to human. For many unlucky people, those flea bites weren't only itchy, they were deadly. As trade routes were established between cities, rats carrying plague went along for the ride. They spread across Asia and Europe, touching off the bubonic plague pandemic of the 1300s and the epidemics of plague that followed, including the Great Plague of London. 3 plagues, 1 cause. There are 3 types of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. All 3 forms of plague are caused by the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Bubonic plague is the most famous and the most feared, but it is actually the least deadly of the 3. In bubonic plague, the bacteria attack the lymphatic system, causing lymph nodes in the patient's neck, underarms, or groin to develop painful swellings, traditionally called buboes, as well as reddish or purple markings on the skin. In 17th century England, these round marks were known as plague tokens. Before the buboes or plague tokens appear, the patients suffer fever, headaches, chills, vomiting, and extreme exhaustion. More than half of all bubonic plague sufferers died within 2 weeks of the appearance of buboes. Pneumonic plague is even more deadly. It attacks the lungs and spreads through the air when victims cough and sneeze. Nearly everyone infected with pneumonic plague will die within 2 to 4 days. It starts with fever and headache, but soon the victims begin coughing up blood and their lungs fill with fluid until they can no longer breathe. In septicemic plague, the rarest form of the disease, the bacteria infect the patient's bloodstream. Death can happen so quickly that sometimes no symptoms appear. When there are symptoms, they include fever and weakness, followed by bleeding from the mouth and nose and internal bleeding. Without treatment, victim of the septicemic plague will die in less than a day. Today, antibiotics can successfully treat about 85% of cases of plague if the drugs are started during the first 24 hours after infection. Although plague is considered a disease of the past, it is alive and well and living in rodents around the world. Plague is endemic in part of Africa, including the island of Madagascar, where the disease infects a few hundred people each year. In 2017, Madagascar had an outbreak of plague that was traced back to a man who developed symptoms while traveling across the island in a shared public taxi. 31 people who came in contact with him came down with plague, and 4 people died. The World Health Organization considers plague a re-emerging disease, a possible threat that requires constant monitoring. Addicted to statistics. In 2020, the world tracked the emergence of new cases of COVID-19 day by day and even hour by hour in the news and on social media. In 1665, people watched the numbers published in the bills of mortality just as eagerly. At least 5,000 copies of the bills were printed every week, and people snatched up the latest issue to find out which neighborhoods had new cases and whether the epidemic was showing signs of slowing down. The bill of mortality, to all our griefs, is increased by 399 this week, and the increase is general through the whole city and suburbs, which makes us all sad, wrote Londoner Samuel Pepys on November 9th, 1665. Anyone following the toll of COVID-19 deaths in the news and on social media would understand just how Pepys must have felt.